Okej, så vi tar vid. Oh no, I guess I should do it in English. Yeah. So we're on the limited resource costless to extract, and so I'm going to do a very quick reminder of where we were in the sort of micro scale of things, and then a bit later on, in an hour or so probably, we're going to take a big step back and have a look at the whole picture again. What are we really trying to achieve here? What are we trying to understand? Okay. So in the micro scale, we're in this DHSS model, right, where we're thinking about the economy as households, firms, and some non-renewable natural resource that is getting used as an input. And we looked at 3 cases, didn't we? This is the third of 3, I think. What was the first one? Remind me, or remind us. Somebody remind us.
It's like the fixed resource, right?
Right. So that was where we weren't sort of digging up coal, we were just getting a constant flow of some input. And you could think of it as just an area of land. We've got this constant area of land which we need to use to have somewhere to produce. Or you could think of it, for instance, as a constant flow of sunshine or wind or something that you're using to make electricity or whatever it might be. And then we found, because we've got this Cobb-Douglas production function, what does that tell us about the elasticity of substitution between the inputs? We call that eta. And we've got Cobb-Douglas. What's eta?
1, right?
Well done. Yeah. So what does that mean? It means that if the price of an input goes up by 1% compared to another input, the quantity of that input demanded will go down by 1% compared to the other input. And if you think of price times quantity as expenditure, that means that the expenditure on the input doesn't change compared to the other input. So it means that the expenditure on the different inputs is independent of the prices of the inputs. Okay. So how much, given this production function, how much do firms spend on the resource? What proportion of their input costs goes on the resource R?
Eta.
Yeah, you're onto it. You should take more weeks off or weekends off. Yeah. So these, it turns out, if we do the math, these are the expenditure shares. Hi, we just started. Okay. So, if given that the expenditure share is constant and R is constant, what can we say about WR really straight away from intuition? If R is constant. So WR has to grow at the same rate as Y, doesn't it? Because this is what you're spending, and this is total expenditure. In perfect competition, firms make no profits, so their total expenditure on inputs is the same as the value of their production. So if R is constant, what can we say about WR?
It goes to right.
Right. Awesome. WR is going to grow at the growth rate of production, or the overall growth rate of GDP, if you like. What was the data I showed you before? We had these lines, didn't we? If this is GDP, one of these is WR and the other is R. Which was which?
The second one was WR.
Did Did you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because GDP like track, no resource use, or they track each other.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's not this case, is it? Because here we said, look, we're just setting R fixed by definition. We're saying, well, that's the area of land. But then we end up switching these, don't we? Because we say, according to the model, if R is constant, then WR should go like this. And I remember, I think I told you, it's kind of tricky to get really nice data on this. But something broadly along these lines seems to be true. If you think about the price of land, for instance, tends to go up as the economy grows. Okay. And then we did the case where you had an unlimited resource, an abundant resource, costly to extract. Okay, yeah, that's this picture. And then we basically made it by construction that the extraction cost stays the same because you need a certain number of widgets to extract each ton of coal or whatever. And since the price of widgets stays the same, the price of the coal is going to stay the same. So then we said WR is going to be constant. And then again, since we know that the share of R is constant, if WR stays constant, then R must track Y. So straight away we get what we saw. So that model seems to fit the long-run aggregate data for things like fossil fuel use, metal use, and so on. Digging up fossil fuels, digging up metals. But, good argument. There's a problem because that's fine for explaining the past and up to now, but obviously this can't go on, right? I mean, it could go on for a while, but it can't go on indefinitely. And probably, I had the example with the Earth's crust, and that was 700 years, like somewhere well before 700 years it has to change. I would say very likely within the next 100 years this really has to change. You know, it's not something that is way, way off. So
It's also like the demand for digging up new, say, metals would probably also decrease because we already have dug up so much metal. Kind of.
we'll talk about that later, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, no, do come with comments like that. Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it's totally obvious that we're ever going to be sort of satiated. There is an idea that actually most of this demand, there's this sort of industrialization phase, and then once you've done that, you're kind of happy. And so we've kind of industrialized, and now it's the Chinese, and then it'll be the Indians, and then it'll be Africa, and then we're done. But on the other hand, you know, we want to sort of put up these huge windmills and God knows what. We want to make tidal barriers, which are going to need like billions of tons of metals.
It's not obvious now.
It's not obvious, yeah. It could be, but it's not obvious. Okay, so we had a couple of models that seem to have some explanatory power. And then we've got this third model, which is the Hotelling model. Okay. Does this one have any explanatory power? So I can't remember, how much did we go through of this? Did we go through it at all or not? I think did I talk about I think I must have talked about the price rising at the interest rate, right? Maybe not.
I'm pretty sure you talked about this because I watched the lecture and you talked about, like, for example, oil. And you were doing this, like, in first best, we would consume the Saudi Arabia oil and stuff like that. So you have.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about. Yeah, wow. That was quite advanced. So we were talking about why does the oil price rise? Yeah, that was probably one of your questions, I think. Because the model sort of says that prices should rise at the interest rate. And prices have risen quite a bit lately. So is that because of scarcity? And I argued no, it's because of market power. And that's what this paper, I got a paper about that, which is on the reading list, called The Elephant in Hoteling's Room. Right, yeah. And then I was talking about this, yeah. So I think I'm going to park this. There's stuff we maybe will need to go through at some point, but we can do it. I'm pretty sure there's a problems class on that. Because I went through that, I went through that intuition we talked about. I could go through some math, but I don't really want to. I think we'll park it and wait for the problems classes, if necessary. But basically, we get the result. Yeah. Given this constant share result, and then Hoteling tells us that WR dot over WR is equal to what? That's equal to the interest rate, isn't it? The resource price has to grow at the interest rate. Here we go again. And then y dot over y. What's that? Well, we can just call that if we call that gy, then what can we say about r dot over r? Okay, time for you guys to do some work. Everyone work out r dot over r based on this. Given Cobb Douglas.
Do we need to do the whole thing?
You don't really need to do any
No.
math.
We
You
should
can just write it down.
Yeah. Because I could do all the math, but I don't know.
Yeah. No, the idea is that you kind of got your head around that, so you can just write it down. I'm thinking.
This one.
Has anyone got anything to show me? You're all thinking. You're going to put r dot over r in relation to gy. So remember, this is y is like the same as the total expenditure on input. And if the fraction that's spent on this is staying the same, which it is, then that means that this must grow at the same rate as y. Because if we're the whole time spending 5% on resources, and if this is growing at 2% a year, y, then this must also grow at 2% a year, right? Otherwise, the fraction is going to change. So So we know that WR times R must grow at the same rate as Y. So then it's just putting that into an equation linking this, this, and this. So really, you should probably not try to write it down in this form to start with. There's an easier form to write it in first, and then you just shift things. Yeah, okay. Okay, so you got, if you start by putting this equal to something to do with this and something to do with this. Okay, so this product has to rise at the same rate as this. Yeah, that's the way to start.
Okay.
That's the easy way to start. You got an answer? Yeah, that's it. And then obviously you want to rearrange to get R dot over R. So you want to start with, the easy way to start is Y dot over Y equals something. Okay. So you definitely need to get to the point before the end of the course, hopefully sooner, where this is like trivial. Okay. So what you should be writing down first is Y dot over Y is WR dot over WR plus R dot over R. Okay. And then of course you can rearrange and say that R dot over R is GY minus rho. Okay. So we've done this a few times, but let's turn this around and say Y equals WRR. And if WR grows by 1%, then Y is going to grow by 1%, isn't it? But if R grows by 1%, that is also going to push Y up by 1%. So this is why Y dot over Y is WR dot over WR plus R dot over R. And as you know, if we had some other equation with some exponentials here, that would change things, wouldn't it? But because these are raised to the power of 1, you just get that very simple result. And you can do the math, you could do it step by step and say dy dt is WR times dr dt plus R times dWR by dt. And then you could, based on that, you could get very quickly to this. Okay. Right, so in this model, we know that this is growing at the interest rate, which is bigger than this, so actually R dot over R is going to be negative. So what you should see if the real economy actually looked like this, or if this was a good metaphor, all these models are approximations, yeah. But if this was kind of a good approximation or a good metaphor for how the real economy works, we should see something like this, yeah. Y WR R. Okay. Which we don't. Anywhere, really. So it suggests that there's no real relevant resource anywhere in the global economy which has this property. That it's effectively, the extraction cost is so low that we can ignore it in relation to the scarcity range. price is almost entirely due to scarcity and not at all due to extraction. If there were resources like that, we would expect to see this for those resources. And then someone can come along, some annoying person can come along. No, someone can come along and pose some very good questions and say, well, come on, what about oil? Because we see in oil, we see the price going up steeply. Well, one thing is, of course, actually, the oil price fluctuates massively, but in the long run, even since 74, not that much has happened. And prior to 74, absolutely nothing happened for almost 100 years. So that's one thing. And then another thing is that there's a bunch of evidence to show that there is massive market power in that market. One is just to look at OPEC and how it works. Another is why are the Norwegians extracting and why are the Albertans extracting at the same time as the Saudis. Okay. So it's kind of odd because this is the model where there was, especially in the 70s and 80s, but still some people today, this is the model where there's been an immense amount of research put into this and different variations and so on. And then a few sort of lone voices are saying, well, hang on, none of this actually fits anything we've set up. But they don't really care about that. It's kind of weird. Okay. There's a thing called the Hartwig rule, which is super complicated and very much misinterpreted. Some people interpret the Hartwig rule as saying that if we invest resource rents in capital, the resource rents in the Hotelling model, resource rent is this, okay? Because everything you pay to the resource is rent, there's no extraction cost. Yeah? If you were to invest that in that model in building up the capital stock, the physical capital stock, then you would have sustainability. Some people interpret the Hartwig rule as saying that. And there's a kind of logic to it. It's a kind of attractive idea that, remember, we've got this going on, and then we've got the input here. And you're running this down. But if you compensate by building up your stock of physical capital, maybe you could still carry on with sustainable production. And the Hartwig says, well, some people think Hartwig says that is the case, but in fact when you do the math and you know what you're talking about, that is not the case. What Hartwig says that if you, it's super complicated. It's basically if you have an economy with sustainable production with this basic structure, then you must be reinvesting your resource rents. But it doesn't say that if you reinvest your resource rents, you will get sustainability. And it's super easy to just construct realistic model economies where you reinvest resource rents and you don't get sustainability. As soon as you have any kind of depreciation in the capital stock here, for instance, then you will never ever get sustainability with this model. Because if you have depreciation of this capital stock, this never depreciates, but it gets used up, right? If you try to replace it by something that depreciates, it's not going to work, is it? Because this is almost run out. You're trying to build up a huge stock of this other stuff, but it keeps depreciating on you. It's not going to work, okay? And of course, if you think about my metaphor with the hammers, it's like pretty obviously not going to work. If you try to you need this flow of oil to run the economy, and you also need hammers to make stuff with. But if the flow of oil starts running out, but then you start saving millions of hammers up. No. Okay. That's kind of an aside. But the key thing is this, okay, that to have a grip on those three models, the land one kind of works for land, but I don't have good data for that. The second one works for the aggregate data quite well, but we know it can't carry on like that. The third one doesn't really fit anything. Okay. So now we're going to look at the model that I put together based on this dilemma, right? And partly, largely, I guess, inspired by, among other stuff we're going to do. Like I said at the start of the course, I was partly inspired to do this by the fact that I had this course. So when I took over the course, it was basically all about sort of this model. No, not this one. This one. And the Hartwig rule and stuff. And I'm like, I can't teach this. This isn't saying anything about how to actually get scalability and what's really going on. So that inspired me to do a whole load of research in different areas. And this is one part of it. Okay. So what we want to do is we want to have a model which delivers maybe we should go and sit over there and by the light switch. Should put it. Okay. We want a model that delivers this for like historical in the short run or long run even, but then somehow evolves into something else in the very long run. So we want it to fit data looking back historically, but also fit what we know has to happen in the future. Okay. So how are we going to do that? So basically what we can do is say, look, instead of just having an absolutely vast resource stock with a given fixed extraction cost, we can have a resource stock which, to the initial extractor, is vast. And the rate of digging down is like trivial. And if you're thinking in 1900 or something, and or even like 1500 or whatever, you're scratching away with your shovel, nothing is happening to this depth, basically. And then you've effectively got the model that we've gone through, number 2. But with growth and improved technology and a growing economy, you start extracting more and more. That's what the model says, isn't it? And then at some point, this depth actually starts increasing. And then your extraction costs increase. Because extraction costs is not just phi x, they are an increasing function of this distance. So then you're going to have a phase where depth is increasing, extraction costs are increasing, and the price will increase. And when the price will increase, what does that do to this? Given the constant share thing, it's going to put the brakes on, isn't it? Because we've got y dot over y is wr dot over wr plus r dot over r. So when this goes from being 0 to being positive, wr dot over wr, then r dot over r goes from being equal to gy to being lower again. So we're going to get something like this going on. And then if we say, imagine that it at some point actually runs out, then in fact we're going to end up with hotaling in the very long run. When if we assume it's absolutely essential, there's nothing else we can use, and it's literally running out, then it's going to become so valuable that the extraction cost becomes negligible compared to the scarcity rent. Okay. And when that is true, we've got this. So then we're going to end up with this, yeah. And that's basically all we're doing in this model, okay. But it's kind of some tricky math, which we're not going to go through in full. So, what do I really want you to get out of this model? I mean, what I really want you to get is what I just talked about. Okay. But I also want you to be able to do, if you look at old exam questions and things, you should have a clear enough idea about how this model is working to be able to do some very simple stuff. But not like derive the whole model, which is super tricky. Okay. So let's just have a look at this. Oh. That text doesn't really make any sense, does it? Never mind. So, what there should have been before that text is like, what factors can affect extraction costs over time? Okay. So, yeah, let's just do this, let's do this verbally, so to speak, rather than me getting you to do it on your own. So give me some thoughts about what factors might affect extraction costs over time. Looking at the picture.
So how much that have been extracted before? The depth?
The depth, absolutely.
Scarcity?
Yeah, so scarcity isn't actually an extraction cost, but it will affect the price.
That's
So it is relevant, even though literally according to the question it's not, but it's but the price, if the scarcity rent is rising, that will push the price up, even though the extraction cost is not affected by the scarcity rent. Okay.
But I was thinking actually like in some kind of like in a long run, like because it is scarce, you would have to travel further, like where you would like basically like yesterday I could dig outside in my garden and get this resource, but now I have to go to Antarctica.
Okay. Yeah. So to me that's captured by the depth.
Okay. Yeah.
So you should think about the depth quite broadly. So it could be literally the depth. What else could it be? There's one other very broad category, like other than depth or somehow distance to Antarctica or whatever is somehow very like depth to me. There's another big category of changes in the nature of the stock that you're extracting, apart from how deep it is. You think of like extracting things like gold and copper, like with coal, and it's pretty much like how deep you have to dig. So for gold and copper, what's it all about? Any mineralogists here? Diamonds.
Does it have to do like with the quality of the resource?
is something called the grade.
Okay.
It's like tons of what you actually want per ton of rock.
Mm.
And for the best stocks of copper, it could be like up to 8%. But they've all gone. At least the ones near the surface. Now it's like 1%. Gold, I don't know, I can't remember, like 0.01% or 0.1% or something, I guess. Diamond would be, I don't know, be very, very low grade, wouldn't it? You're digging up like millions of tons of rock and extracting it on diamond. Okay, so yeah, we can think of depth as encompassing all those aspects. So what else? There's other things. Think about the bloke there, or woman, if she's a woman. What's she going to want at the end of the day?
A wage.
Right, the wage. So that's another key one. And then there's one more, basically.
The kind of machines they have access to?
Productivity. So we could think of the labour and capital together as a unit, and then it's like, okay, but how productive? So we're having to pay for the labour and capital, which we just call the wage. We kind of ignore capital. In the model, we could just call it a wage, but you could think of it as paying for the combination. But then there's also like each unit of labour with associated capital. How much do they get out per day? Which is linked to the quality of the machines and so on. So obviously, higher depth means higher extraction costs. Higher wage means higher extraction costs. But higher productivity will lower your extraction costs. Right? So we want to encompass those things in our model. And so this is the model. So now we've got no capital in the model. So we've just got labour, and you could think of somehow the associated capital is just coming along together with the labour somehow. We're not modelling it explicitly. Okay. So we can, given that, it's simpler to think of labour going to the mine rather than widgets going to the mine. So we've got two uses for labour. One is some of it gets sent to the final good producer, some of it gets sent down the mine. Okay. So how much are you going to have to pay for the miners? Assuming, if we just try to make this nice and simple, what would we assume about how much we have to pay the miners? Obviously, I'm not expecting you to say like $10 an hour. It's like, what can we say? Any thoughts? See, people can work either here or here. So what would make sense to assume?
To have it in wage.
Right. And we call that an arbitrage condition. Yeah? So if we assume that there's no particular skills or whatever specific to either one, that it's not like it's dangerous down the mine or something, we just keep it simple and we just say, look, you can either work here or here. And if there's any difference in the wage, then if this gets paid a bit more than this, everyone's going to want to work in the mine. And that's not going to, can't be in equilibrium. So basically, there's this simple link. And of course, if you said, well, actually people want 20% more in the mine than here, you could do that, it wouldn't change anything. Yeah. Okay, so we've got this arbitrage condition that's saying the wage here has to track the wage here. But what does the wage here come from? Thinking about this. Have a think about that. Chat to your neighbour. Remember, we've got Cobb Douglas. So, yeah, I haven't shown that here. Oh, yeah, it is there. Yeah, so this is our Cobb Douglas production function now. So what can we say about the wage here? Think about that. Chat to your neighbour. I'm going to give you some breathing space and go and get a cup of tea. You could even do a little bit of math if you like. Set up a little profit maximization function.
What can we say on
Ja.
lönen?
Och den kommer också göra den nere i minen. Men har vi förutsatt att det är typ så här perfect competition?
Ja, det måste det. Det finns nog inget, annars hade de sagt det. Ja. Okej. Men så, okej. Erfarenhet liksom att pris, output är normaliserat till pris.
Mm.
Det är bara, ja, så att vi skulle göra det.
Samma procent. Okej då. Minus.
Och
Ja, och så där en extra index. That's like something that we want.
skulle det bli X?
VX. Jag vet inte varför jag skrev V. Jag skrev VX.
Ja. Jag vet inte vad jag ska säga. Fan. Det vet jag. Nej, jag tror inte att det är okej. Jaha. Är det någonting? Nu kör vi.
Eller något som mer så ska jag
Ja, jag antar det. Ja.
Okidok.
Mm.
Oh, lots of smiles until I come back in.
We've written down the profit maximization function, maybe.
Yeah. So what do you reckon? I can't even remember what the question was. What can we say? Yeah. What can we say about the wage here? Does anyone have a?
And we could set up a profit maximization and get the like basic input from the commission.
Yeah.
And get the wage in terms of value and
Yeah. What do we end up with?
1 minus alpha is what
Right. So, so it's basically going to show you that the wages take a fixed share of Y, don't they? So then if Y grows at some rate, what can we say about the wage? It's going to grow at the same rate now. So labour is taking 95% of firm's costs, then which is the same as for the value of firm's production. If the value of firm's production goes up by 2%, then the wage is going to go up by 2%. Okay. So the wage tracks GDP. But what drives GDP growth? It's this, isn't it? And especially if alpha is pretty small, then basically GDP is going to grow at the same rate as AL. Again, we're just holding labour fit. Okay. We could let labour grow, nothing would really change, it would just get more complicated. Okay, so don't think this is sort of depending on that. So broadly, the wage is going to track GDP, which is going to track growth in labour productivity. So what does that tell us about the two effects we talked about? The effect of the wage and the effect of productivity. Next question, think about that. Did everyone get the question?
No.
So, I told you, or we together, we worked out that the wage is going to track GDP, which is going to track labour productivity. So then I'm saying, what can we then say about extraction costs?
Minska.
Yeah.
Uppar dem.
Sounds like you've got an idea.
We said that they would cancel, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
They're going to cancel each other out.
Mm.
Maybe not exactly, because of that alpha is not zero, but pretty much, yeah. We would expect them to cancel each other out. If the productivity increase here is the same as in the final goods sector. That's kind of crucial. If productivity in the mines is going up way faster than in the final goods sector, what will happen to extraction costs then? Up or down? You're onto it. Good, yeah. The extraction costs would go down then, wouldn't they? Because the wage is linked to what's happening in the final goods sector. So if that's going up by 2% a year, but the productivity here is going up by 10% a year, then it's like, wow, we only have to pay them 2% extra, but they're extracting 10% more. The costs going down, aren't they? But in this version of the model, to keep it simple, we assume that the rates are equal. There's a certain amount of evidence that in fact the rate here would be a bit higher than the average rate in the main economy, which would tend to press extraction costs down and to some extent compensate for increasing debt. But that's kind of beyond the course, really. Okay. So all we're really doing here is just formalizing these intuitions. This is the idea, really, for doing this. It's a rule that's nothing to point out. Okay. So what have we got here? X is the rate of extraction in tons per year, say. It's going to be equal to Lx times this productivity term. Okay, so Lx is the number of people in the mine, isn't it? Double the number of people in the mine, you're going to double the extraction. Ax is the productivity of each person in the mine. So you give them a better shovel, which is twice as good, then you will double the extraction rate for given depth. And AD is a function of the depth. Okay. And we have to do something tricky with that link. It's actually e to the power of d. But that makes the math all fall out really nicely. Okay, but you don't really need to worry about that. That's kind of a technical trick. And this is just saying that these two grow at the same rate. And phi is the surface area of the resource. or if we think of it in 2 dimensions, it's the width of this kind of flat stock. Okay, but if we could draw in 3 dimensions, it would be the surface area. So then, given that, it turns out fairly straightforwardly actually that the rate of change of the depth is just the extraction rate divided by the surface area. That's kind of geometry, really. Or would you really call it geometry? Something along the lines of geometry. Okay. And given that, we can work out AD dot, the rate of change of this extraction productivity, kind of, or the overall sort of effect of depth on the extraction rate. Because that's just AD dot is the same as dAd by dt, isn't it? Which is the same as dAd by dd, dd by dt. And dAd by dd is just AD. If you think about differentiating an exponential, and dd by dt is just d dot. So AD dot is AD d dot. AD dot over d is d dot, which is x over 5. So the rate of increase in the difficulty of extraction is proportional to the rate of extraction x. So that's all. All that is just to get to this really simple result. Okay, so far so good. And this is kind of what I want you to be able to do. Assume a primitive economy in which AY is very small. What happens? So, productivity is very low in relation to the surface area of the stock, it should say, really. So what it means is, what's happening to depth in this primitive economy? This is kind of what I already told you about 20 minutes ago. Oh wow, we should take a break. We'll take a break right soon. What's happening to depth in this primitive economy? These productivities are extremely low. AY and AX are extremely low. AD is some number. AX is extremely low. LX is some number. So what's X? It's extremely low, right? So this is like Stone Age humans trying to extract iron ore. So what can we say about the depth? Think about the stocks in Killerland, and then Stone Age humans scratching around.
So we're we barely touched it.
Right. So D will be constant. They're extracting so little that there's absolutely nothing happening to this depth. So D dot is then 0. Good. Well, if D dot is 0, what's AD dot? It's also 0, okay. So that is linked. This is the kind of difficulty of extraction which is directly linked to the depth. That's here, isn't it? Oh yeah, we've got here AD dot is AD times D dot. Okay. The key thing here is to have the intuition, okay? And then if you're comfortable with the math, then you can do it. So don't try and memorize the math here. Try to get your head around the intuition. And then then you should be comfortable, at least by the end of the course, with these mathematical techniques dealing with growth rates, like I was talking about before. Okay. So initially, you've got that D is constant, AD is constant. So that's just a constant, we can ignore it. And what have we got? We've basically just got back the old model number 2. Except instead of widgets as the input with a constant price, we've got labor as an input, the price of which increases, but the productivity of which increases at the same rate. But again then, extraction costs per ton are going to stay constant, and because of Cobb Douglas here, that means you're going to suck in more and more, a bigger and bigger flow of resource over time. Okay. So we've added this debt to the model with a finite stock, but we've said, look, initially, when the productivity is low enough, it's just going to look like that simple model. And this is exactly what we want, right? Because this is what we see for the data. And after the break, we're going to look at quickly at the math for when debt starts to increase and then when we start scraping the barrel. Okay, so let's take a break, 15 minutes. So there's kind of two things here. There's a sort of clever math, and then there's just the intuition. Okay. And obviously, the clever math is far more important than the intuition. If you want to publish something. But what I want you to get is the intuition. Okay. So what is going on here? How are we going to capture what happens as depth increases? So we've got the broad idea that after a while, with extraction increasing exponentially, we said they were just scratching the surface, but at some point, you're actually going to start digging down at a significant rate. And at that point, this is going to start going up at a significant rate, and that will push the price up and the extraction rate down. But can we actually solve a model for this? It turns out that we can. To get the full solution is super tricky, way too tricky for this course. But we're going to look at the balanced growth path, which you can have as a sort of intermediate stage. And it turns out, with this setup, there's a balanced growth path where x is constant. Okay. So remember, initially in the primitive economy, x grows at the overall growth rate. But now we're just going to assume that there's a balanced growth path where x is constant. Okay. So on such a growth path, what have we got? So if x is constant, what can we say about x dot over x?
0.
0. Yeah, good. And if x dot over x is constant, is 0, and x is constant, sorry, yeah. If x is constant, what can we say about ax and ad? So,
Quotient is constant too.
right. The quotient here must be constant, yeah, because we're assuming the whole time. Well, actually Lx could change in theory, couldn't it? If we change the balance here. But that then wouldn't be balanced growth. And we were assuming we're on a balanced growth path. So this must be constant. So then the quotient here has to stay the same. So in terms of growth rates, what can we say? Don't say anything. Talk amongst yourselves. I want you to nail this down, okay? So what can we say about these in terms of growth rates? This is the big lecture where we nail this.
Should either both be equal or zero, both of them? Or one of them can zero, I guess. No, wait, that's not worth much. Yeah, equal or zero.
And of course, if they're both zero, then they're equal.
Yeah.
So they're
right.
equal. So just to be clear then, what's equal here? What is it that has to
The
be equal?
growth rates of AX and AD.
Okay, and if I'm going to put that in like mathematical terminology.
AX point divided by AX.
Yeah, okay, you got it, yeah. AX dot over AX. I just wanted to be super explicit, yeah. AX dot over AX equals AD dot over AD. The growth rates have to be equal. If this goes up by 1%, this must go up by 1%. Okay. So AX dot over AX we're just given, yeah, that's the exogenous rate of technological progress. So then we know that if there's a balanced growth path, this depth factor has to grow at the same rate, theta AY. So the depth factor has to grow at a constant rate. But the growth rate of the depth factor is just x over phi. So then we know that x over phi must be equal to theta AY. So the point is that if there's a balanced growth path, which we kind of assumed there was, then this must hold. Because we said, remember, on the balanced growth path, x is constant. If we rearrange here, we get this. Does this look constant? Yeah. So this is kind of confirming, there might actually be a balanced growth path. Because we said, if there's a balanced growth path on which x is constant, then x must be something. And if we found this something is not constant, that would be a contradiction, and then we could say there's no balanced growth path. But actually, there's something we find is constant. So this is like, maybe it works. So this is the rate of extraction that makes the depth increase in just the right way to keep everything balanced. Okay. And then if we think about the Cobb-Douglas again, if x is constant, what must happen to Wx? Which is like Wr from before, isn't it? Which for some reason I've changed the r's to x's. We've still got Cobb-Douglas here, yeah? So if x is constant, what's happening to Wx? I'll give you a clue. It's the fixed chair thing, you know. So it must be equal to what?
The growth rate of y.
Yes, y dot over y. The growth rate of y. Which it turns out well, let me think. Maybe this is really all we need to know. I don't want to go into more details than we need to. So, what does this path look like? It looks like, if we go back to the r's to match with what we did before, yeah, so r's and x's are the same, okay. Yeah, and then we have the y going on here. But then there's going to be some kind of transition, isn't there? So this is primitive economy, and then it's going to transition. And of course, you can see, if we did the full solution, you can solve it all and get these transitions as well. But that's much more complicated. But you could imagine something like this going on here. Except for some reason I changed the r's to x's, but to link with the previous stuff. Okay. But then, oh, let's just check this next sub-slide. Yeah. So I think we've gone through all that. But then, at some point, the resource is actually going to start running out, isn't it? If this is increasing, we're going down, 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 at some point, if there's a bottom here, we're going to be scraping a barrel. And then the scarcity rent starts rising, which we haven't talked about up to now. The whole time there will be a scarcity rent in there. But towards the end here, it's going to get super important. And right when we're really scraping the barrel, it's going to dominate completely. And when the scarcity rent dominates completely, then we're in the Hotelling model. So we just have the results we went through before. There's still an extraction cost, but it's tiny compared to the massive scarcity rent. So we set up this model. I've taken you through the sort of three extreme cases, but you can actually solve for the whole path if you have more math than you guys have, and more math than we have time. You have time to learn in this course for sure. Okay. And the nice thing is, or this is the kind of theory, but then you can actually set up the model with some sort of arbitrary nature of the stock and say, okay, this is the stock. So here we've assumed everything is really neat and tidy, but we can actually then say, look, this is how we think copper stocks actually look like. And then you can put that into mathematical terms and solve it and derive paths for these things in that case as well. And I do that in the paper for copper. So I've gone into like geological literature about what copper stocks are historically and what's left, and use the historical data to find parameters, and then having found the parameters to then extrapolate into the future and predict copper prices. So that's the kind of thing you can do. In that particular case, I can't remember in detail, but it's suggesting that this kind of process, it never gets this far. This kind of thing is going to happen on a kind of 100-year time scale, that we're going to start switching to more of this kind of regime. Then actually for the total exhaustion, it's like, that's really, really speculative. Because like, imagine that copper literally started running out. What would happen? Would it be like here, in this model, what happens, if in this model, imagine that this is copper and it literally runs out. And there's no recycling in the, we're in the model here, there's no recycling here, is there? And for some reason, whatever, we screw up, it literally runs out. What's going to happen? What happens to GDP?
It will be zero.
It'll be zero, yeah? Will you guys
Yeah.
getting there, or yeah? Gustav, you're the one who's happiest to take the plunge, aren't you? It's going to be 0. If you look at the production function up there, yeah, top left. If x is 0, well, you know. But in the real economy, what would happen if copper ran out? Like, we use copper for a bunch of stuff that if it disappeared, like, GDP would, like, imagine like sort of God or Harry Potter or somebody came along and all the copper disappeared overnight. Or maybe it's this Stone League or whatever they're called in England. Criminal gangs ripped out all the copper and tried to sell it on Mars. That would be a bit of a catastrophe for GDP, wouldn't it? It wouldn't go to 0. But in the slightly longer run, how bad would the news be if copper just disappeared? Like, would we lose 50% of GDP or 5% or?
You would probably find something else to use.
There's a bunch of other stuff, isn't there, which can do more or less the same job. And of course, since copper's around, it's significantly better than other things for certain jobs. If we didn't have it, then, hey, you know, we could go. We might lose, say, 0.1% or 0.01% of global GDP in the long run. Because the point is, there's substitutes here. Here, there's only one material input. If all our material inputs ran out, then we'd be kind of done for. We'd have nothing to make anything with, or to stand on. But if one thing runs out, it's not going to be like this, because you need to think about this as a bunch of these different stocks, different things. So this whole sort of totaling idea, I mean, it's super speculative, and it's never really going to happen. What about fossil fuels, you know? Fossil fuels, like copper, is never really going to run out anyway, because just recycling and so on. But what about fossil fuels? Are they going to run out? Hopefully not, I would say, but why do I say hopefully not?
Because we would stop using them before they run out, because we have alternatives that are better.
And, well,
Like
because of
this
climate change, yeah.
Yeah.
Like, if we used all the fossil fuels up, that would be, like, seriously bad news. But if we just assume, for whatever reason, we just completely stop using fossil fuels, of course, yeah, as you were just saying before I interrupted you,
I don't remember.
there's alternatives,
Yeah.
such as.
Wind power, solar power.
So again, it's not going to be this sort of, as we start scraping the barrel, if we ever were to, for fossil fuels, you wouldn't get this kind of scenario. Because the highest the price can go is the price of the alternative inputs. Okay. Yeah, so that's a little bit about how you can actually use this to try to get your head around or try to make predictions for specific resources. So, in a way, this whole resource supply thing is not really the key problem for sustainability. Okay. So, why did we ever think it was? I don't know if we can't remember if we already mentioned this or if I already mentioned this. Do you know what this is? If anyone can read it. The limits to growth. Does anyone know what that is? It's a thing, yeah, it's not just a phrase. So that was a book or a report that came out in like 1972 or something. And there was a huge amount of publicity about it at the time, and it's still sort of echoing down the decades since. And they're basically saying, look, we're heading for catastrophe. They basically looked at this data. This is the historical data, isn't it? Except they weren't really interested in prices. They just looked at this. And then they said, look, we're heading for the cliff edge. This is not sustainable. We're going to go over a cliff here. And the economists all laughed at them and said that. But then what was the economists' response? It was the DHSS model, based on Hotelling. Which is kind of bizarre. Because, say what you like about limits to growth, but at least their model matched the historical data. Up to the point where we know their model could explain it, and then they said, but then we're going over a cliff. Economists responded to this with this, which said, look, as resources are scarce, if they start running out, the price will go up because of this and so on, because of the property rights and whatever, which is fine, but then the actual predictions of the model they came up with say, let's go back to R, say that R should be doing like this. So in a way, if you take this model at face value and look at the data, you would either say, well, the model's just wrong, or if it's right, then we're not. It's almost that the limits to growth people are correct. We're not behaving rationally. There's some massive mismanagement going on here for some reason, and we are going to go over a cliff. Yeah. Because the economists say, don't worry, when resources get scarce, the price goes up. But then the price isn't going up. So what's going on? So what is going on? Well, according to me, and I think most people would agree with this, like something along the lines of what is described in this model. There's a hell of a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of substitutability between alternative resources, etc. So if you're waiting for this cliff edge, say if you're a sort of a radical green and thinking that maybe when we get to this cliff edge, we'll realize that we don't want to, the radical green doesn't want to see the whole global economy collapse, but they want to see everything sort of slowed down. And if you're thinking, oh, we'll get to the cliff edge and realize and then slow everything down, don't hold your breath. Okay. Well, not based on physical resource scarcity. Okay. There's a phenomenal amount of stuff out there. The only thing that is really significantly limited, you could say, where it's really going to run out in relatively near time, I would say, is fossil fuels. And we want them to run out anyway. And we have the alternatives. So don't hold your breath waiting for resources to run out. Okay. So that's resource supply. But what we're going to do now, and for most of the rest of the course, is look at resource demand and the contact list. So kind of linked to what you were talking about before with the sort of, will we really keep demanding more and more metals? So this is some criticism of the DHSS model from this guy Herman Daly, a sort of leading or well-known anyway ecological economist. So just have a look at that. So what's this all about? So Daly's starting point here is the Solow model, okay, which says y is ALL to the 1 minus alpha k to the alpha. Okay. So there's no natural resources at all. But in the Solow-Stiglitz variant, which is kind of what we now often call the DHSS model, where the two S's are Solow and Stiglitz, we don't only need the cook and the kitchen, but we need some flour, sugar, and eggs. Okay, so what's that? What shall I write here? R. And what else? Have I finished?
The power of beta.
Yeah, and then I need to change in one more place. Someone else?
Minus beta.
Yeah. So all these need to add up to 1, which gives us the constant returns thing. If you double all the inputs, you'll double the output. If you didn't have that, you'd have increasing returns. If you doubled each input, you'd get more than twice the output. Okay. And then he says, this seems great, but then we realize that we could make our cake 1,000 times bigger with no extra ingredients if we just stirred faster and used bigger bowls and ovens. Okay. Is this fair criticism? What do you think? Give me some thought. If you're writing down a production function for cake, what would it look like? Have a think about that. Chat to your neighbour. Would it look like this? And if not, what might it look like?
Har du verkligen? Alltså vad har du verkligen?
Jag tror att han sa att use bigger bowls and ovens, och då tror jag att det är kapital.
Ja, maybe that. Because in theory.
Eller så är det där, det är kanske det som blir grejen.
Är det en bra protokollsfunktion?
Ja, like a-
Det skulle kunna funka. Men kanske man måste se det så här, att det kanske snarare bör vara någon form av så här, det komplementära resurser också. Att det så här, kanske det bör vara en sån här.
Good start.
Så jag tänker på den här början med det där med R. Alltså om det ska vara 0 så kan jag vet inte om
Så där.
Det var inte överhuvudtaget.
Nej.
Precis, det är det som är grejen. Det finns ingen substituerbarhet mellan, alltså så här, en, man måste, måste ha en ersättare.
As the criticism, like in theory, we could increase like K to
Du kan inte than that.
a certain amount of each
Yeah.
to make one cake.
Okay.
Oh.
So I don't know, I didn't hear what you guys were saying, but Vera and Elin at the back said, how about a Leontief? And you were kind of moving in that direction when I kind of, the last thing you said, which to me makes a huge amount of sense, right? Because basically, it's taking this logic. If you're trying to make cake, if you're making one cake and you've got certain inputs, and then you want two, you're basically going to need twice the number of eggs, twice the amount of flour, twice the sugar, and so on. This is Leontief, isn't it? You might not need two ovens and so on. That's more tricky, but you definitely should have some kind of Leontief structure. So y is the number of cakes per year. So what are we going to have here? It's basically going to be r, isn't it? We could put a sort of AR here, but AR is going to be constant. Because there's no way, you can't sort of go and do research and say, oh, now we only need 1 egg per cake, whereas before we needed 4. Yeah, it's not going to work. It's not going to happen. But on the ovens, you could have here, if this is like, you could have ALL and AKK, if you like. These could change. Yeah? You could increase labor productivity and need fewer workers to make the cakes. And you might have better ovens and so on, so you need fewer ovens. But generally, if you have better ovens, they're going to be more expensive, and since these are this is kind of in monetary units, this isn't so relevant. And anyway, we're ignoring capital. But this could grow. But then, if this grows, what's going to happen to this? In practice, if cake producers got to get a lot more productive per labour input, what's going to happen to the egg inputs? It probably is going to grow. Either that or L has to go down. If the sector stays the same in terms of cakes per year, then L is going to fall. If we instead expand production, use this and expand production, then R is going to have to go up here, which is of course what we've seen. But the trouble with this is, okay, so why not just use the Leontief? If this describes cake, and cake you might say, well, it's a special case, but maybe. It is kind of a special case. But still, why do we use the Cobb Douglas? It's easy to handle, yeah, but there's another reason. That is one quite important reason. And sometimes that kind of reason is the only reason economists do things. But in this case, there's another reason. Because it gives us the constant share property, which is what we see in the data. The aggregate data. In the sort of cake making economy, if the supply of eggs went up, if you have sort of just the right amount, everyone's just making cake, and you've got just the right amount of eggs to keep everyone busy. But then suddenly there's a sort of glut of eggs. The supply of eggs goes up by 10%. What's going to happen to the price of eggs? There's nothing to do with eggs except make cake. Okay, it's a very simple economy. We've only got one product, which is cake. The initial supply of eggs is just enough to keep everyone busy making cake all day. But then the supply of eggs goes up. and there's perfect markets, so there's lots and lots of independent egg suppliers. What's going to happen to the price of eggs then, given this production function? It's like, imagine there's a market for shoes, okay? And there's a market, there's suppliers of left shoes and there's suppliers of right shoes, okay? And there's perfect competition between these different suppliers. There's only one type of shoe. They're all the same size, they all look the same. Suddenly, for some reason, there's some imbalance and there's a glut of right shoes. What's going to happen to the price of right shoes? The same? No.
Drop.
It's going to drop. How much?
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
Yes. Good. And in fact, in the ONTF mathematically, it'll go to zero. If you've got some exogenous supply, which suddenly in the sort of oversupply, if you take the model literally, it'll actually go to zero. You won't be able to sell the right shoes for anything because they're in oversupply. There's these excess shoes just kicking around that nobody can ship. So imagine the price of right shoes is 1 öre or 1 crown per right shoe. But still, given this, there's a bunch of people trying to sell right shoes who can't ship them, right? Because there's this oversupply. So then, what are you going? If you're one of these people, what are you going to do? You're going to say, well, I'll take 95 öre. But that still won't be an equilibrium, because if the price goes to 95 öre, there's still going to be a bunch of people out there who can't sell their shoes. There's only one equilibrium price, which is zero. Okay, that's obviously an extreme case, we're just playing with the math here. But the point is that the price, if the production function looks anything like this, price should be very sensitive to supply. Which means that we wouldn't expect to see this kind of thing going on here. If you look at the global oil market, what happens to the price of oil if 10% of global supply gets knocked out by ISIS or whatever? So that's going the other direction. If you lose 10% of supply, what happens to the price? And I'm looking for the answer in the same vein as your answer. Like, does it go up or down, and by a lot or a little? It goes up for sure. A lot, yeah. So when the sort of Gulf War or whatever, we can easily see the oil price like doubling. And it's not that supply halved, which would be a Cobb-Douglas result. Its supply maybe went down by 5% or something. So that, again, looks more like this than this, doesn't it? But still, on the global aggregate, we see this. Long run. Medium run, or short run, like I just said, for the oil, you know, if there's a spike down in oil supply, we get a big spike in price. But then it seems to go back to trend. Yeah? So there's all this short run stuff going on. But the long run seems to look like that. Why? Okay, and what are the implications for sustainability? That is kind of the focus of the rest of the course, pretty much. Okay. What is going on? Okay. See what I've got for you. Yeah. Have a look at that. let me know when you've finished reading it. Okay, I think most of you have finished. Okay, so I should have really given you an intro for this, but since I put it up. So, Solow in 74 was one of the founders of the DHSS model. And central to DHSS is capital. Yeah. It's like this idea, remember I was talking about Hartwig? The supply of the non-renewable has to go down, but can we compensate by building up capital instead? This is like this central question of the DHSS approach. But ironically, only a year before, Solow wrote a paper when he didn't have to do any math, but he could just think freely and write stuff. And it was about, I've rubbed it off, the limits to growth and sustainability. And he never even mentioned capital in the whole paper, which is about 12, 15 pages, I think. Then when he had to do a model, he did one with capital because that's what he knew he could deal with in the math. But when he just talked, he said, these are the key issues. Okay. And these three mechanisms, this is kind of my terminology, his three mechanisms. But this is like the three ways in which you could compensate for this. The stuff running out. Okay. How would you compensate for or deal with your natural resource inputs running out? One is you could increase resource efficiency. Okay, so we skipped capital, so we don't have these loops coming back. So where's the increase in resource efficiency happening? Here, here, or here? 1, 2, or 3?
The first.
2. So we can make more final good with the same amount of flow here, or the same amount of final good with less, if this is running out. Yeah. 2, we can substitute on the consumption side away from products in which the production process is resource intensive. How do we capture that in this model? Have a think about that. How do we capture number 2 in this model?
There's only one.
Made me think of Jaws, which I watched with my daughter a couple of years ago. Don't know if any Jaws fancy. Gonna need a bigger boat. It's a famous quote from Jaws. Gonna need a different model, aren't we? We need a model with multiple products. Yeah. This model's not doing the job. So we need alternative, sort of different final good producers producing different goods. And consumers weighing out, how much of this one should we have, how much of that one? To capture that number 2. Okay, and that's quite a big change in terms of the complexity and so on. That's not a trivial thing to do. What about to number 3? How are we going to capture number 3? Is that so? Number 1 is here. Number 2 is kind of here in a way, but to get the consumers making those choices, we need to make changes here. But the choices are kind of, the action in a way is here. Where's the action for number 3? And where do we need to make changes in the model?
We need to add more resources.
Yep, so we need another box here, don't we? But in a way, the main action is still here. That the firms are going to, let's learn to use this stuff instead of this stuff. That process is happening here. But then that is going to then cause labour to shift into this sector from this one. So these are the kind of ways that the economy could adapt to resource scarcity. If you look at the historical data, and these, so I think this was a really good paper, right? This 73 paper. He's basically nailed it. And it's a kind of a research agenda, because then it's like, okay, but which of these, what's actually happened, which are the important ones, what's going to happen in the future based on these questions. So if we try to interpret the historical data based on this, have a think about that, the last thing we do before another break. How do we match this kind of picture with that? So remember, the mechanisms were about dealing with the resource running out. What's going on here? And we're going to have to somehow change those questions. Have a think about that for a couple of minutes. So has everyone got the question, basically? I mean, it's quite a complex question. It's not a simple question, but it's like, how do we need to kind of change these questions or change our way of thinking about them if we're trying to explain the historical data like that, rather than trying to answer the question of how will the economy adapt if a resource starts running out? Now I want to ask questions about what's been going on for the last couple of hundred years. And these questions don't quite work for that. How can we rephrase them or change them?
Any thoughts?
I would say that we should change our consumption patterns. Or, like we talked in the beginning of the course, that we do improve the efficiency that we use the resource, but at the same time we change our consumption patterns, and that's why the R is different. Yeah, that's why we don't use less.
Yeah, like the only thing that happened is like we've done number 1, but we still increased consumption. We haven't substituted and we haven't like focused on any alternatives, or maybe we haven't that much enough. Maybe.
I think
But
all
they
of
asked
that
for us to
is
adapt these 3 to
Yeah.
this one.
Yeah.
So that we
Yeah,
have
just
to
that-
go the other way around.
Yeah, we only matched it.
and say what do we change in 1, 2, 3 to make it work with that one.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we have no. We have been doing number 3 at least, like kind of working on alternative resources.
But could we just add that we should not increase consumption? Like half.
Okay. So you mean
Well,
how
instead
to...
of substituting consumption, we have increased
Yeah, because we do, I would say that we do substitute consumption from resource-intensive products, but we also buy we just buy more.
Yeah.
Like we do buy more environmentally friendly products, but we buy them on top of it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
What?
I let's see. I guess it's still it's more like it should be more like of a description and not normative, like of what we should do. I don't know. Whatever.
Okie doke, what have you got for me? Any ideas?
I think we interpreted the question a bit differently, all of us.
I think we started discussing to like trying to think about how to change that one to this one.
Yeah,
That
okay.
was the other way around. What's your question?
Okay,
was.
yeah. But that's still helping, because then you're getting your head around. Because there's obviously a mismatch between the two, isn't there?
Yeah.
So what's the mismatch? Like, if these things are going on, what would we expect to see over there?
I would say it's because we change our consumption patterns, or like that we talked about in the beginning of the course, because we consume more, and even though we have people on people, so like we consume more resource-intensive stuff and more stuff.
Right, you're jumping ahead, but yeah, I agree. In fact, you're jumping about 3 steps ahead. But I agree. But can I just bring you back to my question, the more straightforward one. If these 3 things were happening to a great extent, or especially if 1 and 2 were happening to a great extent, let's park 3 for a while, then what would you expect to see here in terms of what should R be doing? Right. And if we think if 3 is happening and R is the one we're moving out of, then again it should decline. So these things should all be driving like declines in R, which is the whole point, right? Because then we can get by even though R is running out, or the stock is running out. But in fact, R has been increasing. It's not just been constant, it's been like increasing. So you might wonder, well, are these things all going in reverse? Is it that we're reducing resource efficiency? Or are we substituting towards resource-intensive production processes? Okay, and presumably this isn't happening because the stuff's not running out. So we need to, basically what I was getting at, which I think you've basically got the idea of, we need to somehow put these into reverse to explain the data, right? Somehow. There's something in this must be going the other direction. If not all of them. Maybe some of them are just not working and others. And of course, if we want to predict the future, we want to at least be able to understand the past with the same model. Otherwise, it's kind of, we build a model to try to predict what's happening in the future, and it doesn't, can't explain what's happened in the past. That's not very encouraging, is it? It's not very confidence inspiring. For troende givande. Okay. So ideally we wanted models where we can explain what's been happening up to now and also make predictions about the future. And Elin, you had an explanation. You had an idea for that, right? So just give us again what you said, if you can.
That we, like the problem is that we change our consumption patterns and consume more.
More resource intensive stuff.
Yeah.
like Y going up, that's sort of consuming more in value terms. But on top of that, we tend to shift over time into more and more resource intensive choices. And what about number 1? So what direction are we going in there? In a way, this is sort of preempting half the rest of the course.
I mean, we have increased resource efficiency. Is that
Yeah. We have. Like if you look at sort of the motor in your car today and compare it to the motors we had in the 60s or 70s, it's pretty clear that like if you compare for the same power output and you look at the fuel consumption per power output, it would be at least double the power output per litre of fuel today for a typical car.
Instead, we started selling SUVs.
Right, and that's when number 2 kicks in.
Yeah.
So why doesn't that increase in power output per unit of fuel show up in the aggregate data over to the right? Because if the fuel efficiency was increasing at the same rate as labor efficiency, and we just had widgets, then R would be flat, wouldn't it? But for some reason, R is going up. And it's because of number 2. Okay. But then number 3 is kind of a bit, so that's sort of the relationship between 1 and 2 somehow. And number 3, I guess the big question there, well that's a lot linked to pollution when we start talking more about pollution. So even if resources aren't running out, we've still got this big problem with pollution, like we want to stop using fossil fuels, for instance, because of the pollution. Can we switch to alternatives? How will that process work? Okay. So this is kind of what we're going to be looking at in the rest of the course. And these questions, they just don't get any traction really in the DHSS model. And a big part of the problem is that you just assume this, which kind of gives you the aggregate data, but you lose all the intuition. What we need is something more like this, but with multiple products and multiple alternative inputs and endogenous changes in these to start capturing these different mechanisms. Yeah? So a lot of the mechanisms are about how these things change relative to each other. And if it's AR1, R1, AR2, R2, and so on. So that's the kind of model we need to investigate these questions. Okay? And that's what we're going to do in a big part of the rest of the course. Okay, so I've already talked about all that. And that's just the attempt at a joke. It's a very old joke. So the guy on the ground there is the economist. So we tend to just set up problems in a way that we know that we can analyze and get a map out, and try to conveniently ignore aspects that make it tricky to model, like the fact that there's more than one good in the economy. Or that, which is crucial here to really understand natural resource demand, you need multiple goods. But 95%, 99% of macro models assume only one good. So you're in that mindset, you just don't see it. If you've got only one good, the only thing that can save you kind of is resource efficiency. If you're in Cock Douglas, then not even resource efficiency can save you, because it just raises overall productivity and you still end up using more resource. If you imagine, we talked about this earlier, if you imagine, this is 2 or 3 lectures ago, if you imagine throwing in an AR here, AR goes up, you don't use less R. You can effectively take the AR out, you've just raised productivity, you're going to suck in more. But if you have this kind of setup, then this leads to a saving in this. So we need a different way to set up the whole model to capture this stuff. Okay, time for a break.